I'm Alan Lester. I'm Professor of Historical Geography at the University of Sussex, and I've been researching and teaching the British Empire for about 30 years now. I've been spending a lot of time recently talking about slavery in British history to people who really don't want to hear it. I don't mean haranguing shoppers in Oxford Street, but talks to church, community and business groups comprised of small c conservative white people who've been willing at least to hear me out. I've kept it factual and based it on two main databases, slavevoyages.org on British participation in the transatlantic slave trade and UCL's Legacies of British Slavery on slave ownership. On every occasion there have been two main objections. In case it's useful for others, here they are with my own attempts to put them in context. So the first thing I'm often asked is, what about other slave systems? Notably the Muslims or Arabs or Barbary corsairs, weren't they just as bad? Well, as an historian, I emphasise explanation rather than casting judgment on whether aspects of history are more or less bad or good, leaving the latter to the reader. But of course, as a human being, I think slavery is always bad, and that it's impossible and facile to try to compare the relative suffering of those subjected to different kinds of slavery. But if people want an historian's comparison between the European, transatlantic and Islamic slave systems, rather than just a deflection from discussing the European one, here it is. So the Arab slave trading system along the East African coast, across the Red Sea and the Sahara Desert, took some 4 to 10 million people into captivity over a 1,000-year period. The transatlantic system was far more intense, taking over 12.5 million captives across the Atlantic in a 350-year period. Islamic systems of slavery largely disregarded ethnicity or race. Captives were taken from sub-Saharan and North Africa and from Barbary raids across the Mediterranean into Western Europe. In the transatlantic system, captivity was exclusive to black African people, with enduring implications for European ideas of racial difference, developed to explain and justify the system. In the Arab system, captives often became free through conversion to Islam, and their children were not necessarily born into a state of captivity. It was possible for many who were initially sold to reach a higher rank in the host society. In the transatlantic system, few captives could gain manumission, and captives' children were not only born into a state of slavery, but were regularly separated from their parents through sale to other owners. In the Arab system, captives were taken for domestic or military service or for sexual exploitation, as well as agricultural work. In the transatlantic system, captives were exploited for all these purposes, but their primary purpose was twofold: to serve as capital assets upon which loans could be leveraged, and to produce and refine commercial crops on semi-industrialised plantations. Both their value as assets, which amounted to 40% of British government revenue in 1834, when compensation was paid to their owners for their emancipation, and their unpaid work transformed the global economy and helped transform Britain into an industrial power. The second question I often get asked is, why should we worry about or consider reparations for something that ended long ago? After all, we don't demand reparations from the Romans. Well, the inequalities inherited from the Roman Empire in Britain in roughly 400 AD have dissipated over the intervening 1,600 years. We find it very hard now to distinguish people who are structurally disadvantaged by it. By contrast, the inequalities inherited from 350 years of Atlantic slavery, ending around 200 years ago, are still deeply inscribed in our society. The reasons for this include the racialised nature of the Atlantic system, the explanations of racial difference invented to justify it, that's racism, and the fact that when the system was ended, it was slave owners who were compensated to the tune of £20 million, while enslaved people were released without any assets to pass on through subsequent generations. There's plenty of data demonstrating enduring racial inequalities within the UK, let alone between the UK and Caribbean countries. Caribbean and British black employees have consistently earned less than white employees between 2012 and 2022. Around 17% of the total British population live in social rented housing, and this figures 48% for black British or Caribbean people. The highest percentage of people who are unemployed is also in this category, and especially among those aged 16 to 24. Black offenders are more likely to be remanded in custody and to receive higher sentence lengths than white offenders for the same offences. People classified as black are 3% of the population, but account for 18% of stop and searches, 9% of arrests, 11% of prosecutions, 10% of convictions, 12% of custodial remands, 10% of criminal sentences and 13% of the prison population. 32% of children in prison are black. As the official report into the Windrush scandal explained, it had happened in part because of the public's and officials' poor understanding of Britain's colonial history, the history of inward and outward migration, and the history of black Britons. As David Olusoga has written, those wrongly caught in the dragnet of the hostile environment were the children of men and women who had been encouraged to migrate to post-war Britain. These people, with their centuries-long links to Britain and British history, were suddenly classified as illegal immigrants in the country they had called home for decades. If we care about social cohesion, perhaps it's best not to dismiss anti-racist protesters as US-influenced radicals, and not to turn a blind eye, distract from, or deny the role of slavery and racialised exploitation in British history, but to inquire what can be done to address the structural inequalities it initiated.